I would like to introduce our next two speakers. They are going to share their talk, and so hopefully we'll get our technology working smoothly. They've already done a pre-test, so hopefully this will be incredibly smooth. I'd like to introduce Ashwini and James Pennebaker. Thank you so much for joining us today from very far away at a very early time of day. I'm so grateful to you both. And we are very much looking forward to your talk today on the unfolding of the COVID outbreak and the shifts in emotions, thoughts and patterns and social connections. This will be the first talk in the series today on the more emotional aspects of COVID-19 and its effect on us. Over to you, Ashwini. I see that you are the first to share your screen.
And I'm going to start, and we're going to go back and forth, although Ashwini is going to do most of it. I wanted to just give a little bit of a background. For the last many years, I have occasionally become fascinated by cultural upheavals. So the first one was the Mount St. Helens volcano many years ago. And more recently, I did after that, I tracked a large bombing that occurred in the United States, and then another bombing, the Boston Marathon bombing. September 11th was a project that I did a lot of research on. The Mount St. Helens, the Loma Prieta earthquake, which was a San Francisco earthquake, and then America's going in, and much of the world going into the first Persian Gulf War. And in all of these, I was interested in the social dynamics that occur when something happens. And typically with things that I had seen was immediately afterwards, there was kind of this snapping of attention that people started paying close attention to the events that were occurring. But then, and in so doing, it also tended to make them paying less attention to themselves, and it was associated with reductions in anxiety and interesting, especially reductions in feelings of anger. Now, all of these early studies were all done with self-reports, except for some of the September 11th data projects. And the other thing, and this seemed to be a common thing, was it had this sense of bringing people together. And this bringing people together fundamentally changed some of the social dynamics that were associated with an upheaval, and it, in a way, almost makes many of them feel better. It's much like going to a funeral and having this sense of community and sense of belongingness that's brought up. And I was fascinated in watching the early days of or the coming of the coronavirus, because this was something so different. And in early March, Ashwini and I have been working together for the last few years. We were talking about this, and this was the day before we were quarantined. And we saw this giant tidal wave coming toward us. And we started talking about this because she and I have been doing some work on groups and group dynamics and how people feel parts of groups. And we started to wonder, what's going to happen here? This seems as though there's something profoundly important from a social psychological perspective. And that was the beginning of this project. And the day that we were quarantined, we started talking with each other online, and we started a very, very large project. And this project has now grown in many, many different directions. And that's what we'd like to tell you about today. So I want to turn this over to Ashwini, who is really, I view as kind of she's the primary investigator here. Ashwini, take it away.
Thanks, Jamie. So as Jamie just said, we were very interested in understanding how experiencing this whole COVID crisis could affect people in very fundamental and basic ways. So we were interested in very big picture questions like, how is this affecting what people pay attention to? How is it affecting our emotions, how we think, and our social connections? This is probably a picture that's a working model of our entire project, but today I'm just going to mainly focus on emotions and social connections. I'll very briefly talk about attentional processes, but just because of shortage of time, we will not be able to talk about thinking styles. And before getting into the methods and results, I want to provide a very brief overview of the timeline of COVID in the US. Although COVID emerged in 2019, late 2019 and early 2020, in the US, its effects were not significantly experienced until the last week of February, which is when all the warning signals emerged. So the biggest warning signals, I think, were that in the last week of February, the US stock market began to fall, and very shortly after, there was an outbreak in Washington state marked by the first death in the US. And a couple of weeks after that, things got more serious. COVID was declared a global pandemic. President Trump declared it a national emergency. And almost overnight, most cities shut down. That was when we started working on this project. Most people started isolating themselves at home. And like Jamie was saying earlier, there's been a lot of work done on disasters in the past, and they typically show that most of the effects, they dissipate after about 6 weeks from the onset of the crisis. And of course, COVID is an ongoing crisis, so that's unlikely to happen. But what we thought was that about 6 weeks from the beginning of the crisis, people might start beginning to adapt to this new normal that life during COVID is. So overall, we thought of this timeline as having 4 different phases, starting with baseline, and then the warning signals first emerged and people are dealing with this warning of an impending crisis. And then it hits home and everyone's isolated at home. And then there's an adaptation stage where people are starting to get used to life during COVID. And we approached this project in 2 ways. As Jamie was saying, in the past, there's been a lot of work using self-report, but we were very interested in understanding the temporal effects, like going back in time. Can we track people over time to understand what the psychological effects they experienced are? And for this, we thought a great way would be analyzing people's natural language that they use on social media. And we picked Reddit, and we picked Reddit particularly for those who are not familiar with Reddit. Reddit is a social media platform that has thousands and thousands of communities with a lot of people. And they have a lot of city communities, which was particularly relevant to this project. And what I mean by a city community is that, for example, I live in Austin in Texas, and Austin has a pretty large community on Reddit. And this is a community where people from Austin just talk about things that are relevant in the city. So restaurants, concerts, traffic, anything that comes up in the city. So we studied 18 such city communities corresponding to cities in the US. And the time period we looked at was January 10th to May 23rd. May 23rd, just because that was right before all the Black Lives protests began in the US. And as you can see in this map here, we had 18 cities and covers a lot of regions in the US. And overall, from all these cities together, we extracted about all the conversations that happened on Reddit in this period. That was essentially 1.8 million posts from over 200,000 people. And we then supplemented this analysis with a large-scale survey that we put up on this website. And we released the survey publicly on the 19th of March. And data collection is still ongoing, but just for this analysis, we analyzed only data that we got until the 23rd of March. And the survey is available in several languages internationally, but for this study, again, we restricted it to the English survey and just people from the US and Canada. And we recruited participants in 2 ways. One was we put it up on the website and shared it with people we know. It was essentially snowball sampling, and we got about 8,800 people in this time period. We probably have over 15,000, 20,000 now. And we wanted to have a replication sample, which was Prolific. For those of you who aren't familiar with Prolific, it's a website on which people complete studies. And from that, in this period, we have about 2,000 participants. Okay, so getting to what we found, the first question we asked was, how much are people thinking about COVID? Has this affected what we attend to? And for this, we thought a great idea would be to look at people's conversations on Reddit to understand how much they're talking about COVID, because if people are thinking about it, they're likely to talk about it. So what we did was, in all the comments that we downloaded, Reddit social media comments that we downloaded in that time period, for each comment, we counted how much people made references to COVID using words like COVID, pandemic, coronavirus, and so on. And we then tracked this over time, which is the graph that you're seeing here. I'll just orient you to this graph in a second. The gray dotted line here, that refers to data from 2019 in the same time period. And not surprisingly, no one talked about COVID then, which is why it's a flat line here. And the blue line is what we are interested in, which is the 2020 line marking references to COVID. And the vertical bands here, they demarcate they delimit the temporal phases I was talking about earlier. So this is baseline, this is when all the warning signals emerged, this is when people started isolating themselves, this is when we expected that things would stabilize a little bit. And as you can see here, there's a huge surge in talking about COVID in the last week of February. This is very interesting just because this was at least 2 weeks before most cities shut down and we began to isolate ourselves. This is still the time when we knew there was a threat coming. There were all these warning signals, but it hadn't really come yet. And it increases, and there's another increase. It reaches its peak mid-March, and that was probably the beginning of the isolation phase, because that's when COVID was declared a national emergency and most cities shut down. And you can see sorry, Jamie, go ahead.
I was going to just jump in just as a side note. What's so important about this is to keep in mind that these are people all over the country in these 18 cities simply going to their city Reddits, and they're on the city Reddits they're typically talking about music venues, they're talking about food, they're talking about the local gardens and so forth. And the conversations across all of 18 of these cities, which were remarkably similar, are all talking. They're now starting to bring up COVID, and we can't get into it in this brief talk, but what was so striking is, although the cities were virtually identical, 2 of the cities started talking about COVID much earlier, and one of them was Seattle, which had the first break of it, and they started but maybe 2 weeks earlier, and New York City, which also started talking about it early, and also started having sickness and death at much higher rates earlier.
As Jamie said, there are these New York and Seattle started talking about it earlier, but the shape of the graph is still pretty much the same. They all reach its peak around this time. And since from here, you can see that there's a drop in talking about COVID, but it's significantly above baseline, indicating that even in May, this is something people were talking about quite a lot. Moving on, the next main question we asked was how COVID has affected our emotions. And here we looked at 4 emotions. I'll start with anxiety. And the approach we took here is very similar to the one that I just, with the COVID analyses. And our assumption here is that when people are anxious, they would, it'll show in their conversations. They might use words like afraid, scared, anxious, and so on. So here we tracked how much people used anxiety-related words in their Reddit conversations. And as you can see here, again, the gray line is 2019 and it's pretty flat, but in the blue line, there's a huge increase. It's almost baseline is about 0.2, it almost doubles to when it reaches its peak. And again, the increase in anxiety begins even when warning signals emerged much before isolation began. Again, this also reaches its peak mid-March. And although there is a decrease, you can see that it's still pretty elevated even a few months after the crisis. We also looked at positive emotion, and this graph is almost the mirror image of the anxiety graph, except in the opposite direction. There's a drop in positive emotion as soon as warning signs emerge, reaches its bottommost point mid-March. And although positive emotion increases since then, it's still pretty low. It almost looks like we are now used to this new normal of COVID, and people are a little more anxious and a little less happy than before. The third emotion we looked at is sadness. Here also, just to remind you again, what we did, we tracked how much people use words indicating that they were sad in their conversations. And even here, the 2019 line is pretty flat. But 2020, the graph looks a little different than the anxiety graph. You don't see any changes when the warning signs emerge, which makes sense because when you know that there is an impending crisis, there's no time to be sad. It's likely that anxiety is an adaptive emotion that people would feel then. But especially since isolation here begins, this is the time when people start staying home. You can see that there's a slow increase in sadness. It's almost like people are getting just a little sadder day by day. And by this point in April and May, there's a clear difference between 2020 and 2019. And the last emotion we looked at is anger. And this is one that Jamie referenced in his intro. This is consistent with some past findings in which there was a drop in anger in the beginning and at the onset of a crisis. And here as well, we see the same thing. And one possibility is, like I was just saying, anxiety is a very adaptive emotion in times of threat, and anger is perhaps not, and especially with COVID, where there is no clear outgroup or anyone to be angry at least in the beginning, we see that anger is a bit diminished. And I just want to pause here for a second, talk about the 4 emotions. And overall, we found that there was a huge surge in anxiety, drop in positive emotion, also a slow increase in sadness. But I think there are 2 things that are very interesting here. One is that most of these effects started before people's life really got disrupted. So before the isolation phase, even when warnings had emerged. And the second thing that I think is very interesting is that even several months after the crisis, these changes are visible, suggesting that we may have these changes. There may almost be like we're stably a little more anxious, a little less happy than before. Moving on to the second question we're going to talk about today, we asked how much the COVID outbreak is affecting our social relationships. And here, like Jamie was saying earlier, in past crises, people came together to cope with the crisis, support each other, but this is a unique crisis in which we're all home. Even now, we're all connecting over Zoom from home. So this may be a unique crisis in which it's interesting to understand whether people are really able to come together and how this is affecting our relationships. And we addressed this question in 2 ways. First, we looked at our survey, and in our survey, we had asked people how much more or less connected they felt with various groups. So we looked at 4 groups here: family, friends, city, and country. And for each group, people had to rate on a scale of 1 to 5, going from much less connected to much more connected, how much their feelings of connection had changed relative to before COVID. And what you see here is that the only group for which people said they were more connected with than before, so it's above the midpoint, which was about the same. The only group is family. With all other groups, people are at least perceiving a sense of disconnect from their friends, from their city, and even their country. And this was the snowball sample with about 8,800 participants, and we replicated this effect using our prolific sample to 1,000 participants, and you can see that the effects are almost identical. And here what we thought was, if this was the case, if people were really feeling disconnected from all these groups, would we see this in their conversations? And our assumption here was that when there's a group that we care about, that we feel connected with, we would likely think about the group and therefore talk about them. So what we thought was, if we went into Reddit, like a emotion analysis, and looked for how much people talk about each of these groups, we thought that we would find a similar effect. So that's what we did. And the logic of these analyses is the same. So first we looked at family, and we looked for how much people make references to family using words like mother, father, son, wife. And for most of the language analyses, I should have said this earlier, for most of the language analyses, we used Luke 2015. So Luke 2015 has a family dictionary, which is what we used here. And what we find is that there was an increase in talking about family in the first months, at least for the first 1.5 months from the onset of the crisis. You can see that people are talking more about family, reached its peak mid-March. And this is consistent, if you remember a survey finding that I just presented, this is consistent because people are talking more about their family. That's consistent with them saying they feel more connected to their family than before. We did the same analysis with friends, and here you see that there is a drop in talking about friends. So people aren't talking about friends as much as before. This is words like friend, buddy, friendship. This is also consistent with the survey finding that it's possible that people are feeling less connected to their friends, therefore they're thinking less about their friends, talking less about their friends. And we are interpreting this as an out of sight, out of mind kind of phenomenon because we're all not able to hang out with our friends and colleagues in the way we used to before. We also looked at how much people reference their city. We measured this using just words like city, county, and the names of all the cities in our data set. And clearly there's a huge drop in talking about city, which, and this is one of, I think, our biggest effects. And this, again, is also consistent with the survey finding that people are feeling less connected with their city than before. The last group that we looked at was country, and because most people on Reddit tend to be from the US, we focused on the US in our analysis here. We looked at for how much they make references to the US, words like USA, the US, country, and so on. And you see that it's clearly a very noisy graph. And one of the issues is that mentions of the US follow the news cycle. There's the US features in a lot of news. And when people talk about the news, they tend to use words relating to the US. But you can see here that there is a small increase, which doesn't really go with our survey finding, where we found that people feel less connected to the US than before. So to understand this further, we did another analysis, which we won't have time to present today. But what we thought was, could this really, because when people talk about COVID cases count, growth rate, they talk about the US and COVID in the US a lot. So we thought this might reflect more news-like formal impersonal references to the US rather than more personal connection-like references. So we separated more impersonal references like the US, United States, the kind of words that would be used in the news, versus more personal, our nation, our country, America, words like that. And what we see is that this effect seems to be largely driven by more news-like references. But what I want to point out here is that it's still, from this analysis overall, it doesn't look like there is much evidence for people feeling more connected to the US than before. And just for a second, because I presented a lot of groups, I want to bring them all together in this graph. This is just the same analyses that I just showed you, except they're all in one graph, and the y-axis is standardized. So with seeing the orange line, you can see that people are talking more about friends than before. Talking about city has gone down, friends has gone down. With country, it's a little more complex. And bringing back our survey finding, you can see that it's almost parallel. And overall, together, they seem to indicate that the only group that people are feeling more connected to is family, and there seems to be a sense of disconnect with all these other broader social groups beyond family. I'll just quickly summarize what we found. I mean, needless to say, COVID has had these huge social psychological impacts on society. One of the most interesting things for us analyzing the Reddit data has been that these effects, they began even before isolation, when there was a warning of a huge crisis. And with emotions, we found that people are less happy, more anxious, less angry, and just a little sadder as isolation continues. And what is one interesting thing about the emotion effects is that they stabilized by April, suggesting that people are just stably more anxious and less happy than before. And an interesting question this raises is whether this could reflect just a changed baseline, a new changed psychological state where we're a little more anxious and less happy than before, but we can't know yet. We'll have to wait and see. And with the last analysis I presented, it looks like people feel more connected with their family, but there seems to be a disruption of their sense of community because people are perceiving a sense of disconnection and also not talking as much about groups beyond their family. Go ahead, Jenny.
So one thing I want to emphasize is in other work, we've almost always found that by 6 weeks afterwards, people are pretty much back to baseline. So for example, we looked at September 11th through blogs, and we found that negative emotions were elevated for maybe 11 days afterwards, and then they were back to baseline. Positive emotions dropped very quickly, but only for 4 days. And by then they went back to baseline and ironically went above baseline after that 4-day mark for the next 2 months. What's so striking is that we're seeing these elevations in anxiety, and especially anxiety, persisting through the end of this project, May 23rd. And I should say that we're still seeing that is elevated. In other words, here is a phenomenon we're seeing that is bringing about profound long-term changes in social behaviors and social references, as well as emotional as well. And as we will undoubtedly talk about in later studies, we have reason to believe that this may have accelerated the degree of anger and hostility that's occurring among the subgroups in the United States, and I think worldwide, that this anxiety is being channeled in many other directions.
Ashwini, were you going to say anything more?
No, I was just going to conclude. Thanks Shashank, who put together a website, everyone in our team and our international collaborators. And with that, we're ready for questions.
Well, I first of all have to thank you so much for that incredibly comprehensive talk. I think it's a lesson for any young researcher, and that's one of the main driving missions of Social Bridges, that we make this link between early and senior researchers. And what you just did was a masterclass in really thinking about the mechanism that underlies the effects you're seeing, so your attentional focus, and then the downstream effects. And then even after that, telling us about the longitudinal story of it, how that's going to continue to be a change from baseline, or in fact change the said baseline. And so maybe to that point first, although I have about a million things I want to ask you and press you on, is the last thing that Jamie, if I might call you that, is one thing that obviously you focused on the US, but the US is not an island, irrespective of what some people think. And there is clearly a ping pong effect. Perhaps things, the cases go down in some places, but you're obviously affected by what's going on across the Atlantic. And, we have flare-ups, and that makes you start to worry. We have to think that this is a social signaling activity. When we're going onto Reddit, it's to tell people, I'm worried, I feel disconnected, and so on. So I wonder what you think about this suggestion that it's a ping pong effect across very large groups of people.
It's interesting. Of course, that's true. And despite our illustrious president, who may not be aware there's other countries, we are seeing these both cross-country, cross-cultural bounces in terms of how people are dealing with COVID. But we're seeing this very much in the United States. So we've had regions where people have not been affected much, and then those that have been affected a great deal. And what's been so interesting is the degree of politicization that's been going on here. And that certainly is being affected by Trump, I believe. But this idea that over the last, and we're seeing this, what we're starting to discover is that the issues about wearing masks and behaving in a sane way is now being split along political lines, almost as though it's serving as a rationale for believing that this is either not a big deal or it is a big deal. I find it quite interesting how this is occurring, and I would suspect that comparable things are emerging in most of the other countries. And think about it. This goes back to Freud, to attribution theory and others, which is when you have a large group of people who are always anxious, not having connections to their normal social networks, they are having plenty of time to hatch plots to start to pick fights with others.
So we have a question on the topic of anger, which has just popped up on the chat. So maybe I'll segue from that into your very interesting results on emotions. And obviously I have lots to ask about anxiety, but then you came to anger. And although you say that, there's been overall less anger, clearly from your graphs, we see an uptick in anger, and maybe this is to do with blame and indeed polarized blame. So the question from Anirudh Tagat, who was one of our speakers yesterday, he says, thank you for the very interesting talk. I might have missed it, but is there a way to distinguish anger towards their own communities, people not adhering perhaps to social policies, versus anger directed towards the government? Is that something you can look at if you haven't already in your language data?
Ashwini, you want to take that?
Sure. We haven't directly looked at it, but someone we're working with recently wrote a blog post on our website looking at how much the extent to which people are angry at the federal government, the state government, and so on. So I think it's definitely possible to try and understand who people are really angry at. We haven't so far separated it into anger against people in our community versus other communities, but that's definitely possible. And that's a very interesting question. And I think we'll see something because if I could just for a second go back to our anger graph, there is, like you're saying, there was an uptick in anger here, and this peak here, this is I think April 15th or sometime around then, and that's when all the protests against lockdown, protests against masks and all of that began, which is, it's hard to say whether this anger reflects people's anger against lockdown or the counter response to that. It's hard to know, but clearly I think that's when the polarization really started, because that was all over the news. And you see after that, there's like a new baseline with anger. So I definitely think we should do that, and we might see this effect.
Well, I mean, yeah, go ahead, Jamie, go ahead.
Also, I want to make a pitch for the power of studying natural language. It's so exciting. So what we're able to do, and what we will be doing, is we can go find anger words in these giant corpus of data, and you can find when a person makes reference to anger, and then you look at the words, maybe the 5 words before versus the 5 words after, and what we'll be able to do is to computationally find out what they're using these anger words to reference. So this is something that is easily done.
So you stole the words out of my mouth, Jamie. I was just about to say that it's such a wonderful approach, because obviously as a verbal species, that's what we do. We talk before we act. We try and become aligned through speech as well as through actions. That sort of leads me to quickly do a quick ad that our next conference in the series is on this particular topic of group alignment in networks and teams, and perhaps we can have a chat with you on some of this data under that umbrella, but also your data sounds so fascinating. Perhaps it's readily available for others to use. If so, perhaps you can send links to either the blog or to the data onto our whiteboard. And because our next speakers are ready to take over, I just want to thank you both again so very much for this wonderful talk, for this wonderful approach, for the masterclass in how to really tell a story. I hope it can be shared and reused for lots of up and coming scientists to see how it's really done. Thank you both, and for such an excellent division of labor too. Thank you once again to you both. I hope you can go and have some breakfast or some coffee, and perhaps keep listening. And as I said, there's some, I'm sure there'll be some more chat going on, and if not, perhaps you can